My name is Chris Ortiz, and I'm here to talk to you about how trauma affects you physically and emotionally. I've been able to study closely on the anatomy of the human brain and why it responds the way it does. One negative factor that I was able to witness was children affected from trauma all the way up to adulthood. This goes into a psychological level way further than the anatomy of the brain. As I mentioned earlier, children do suffer from traumas, and they end up carrying that trauma to their adulthood if they're not treated. Something different and that's sad and interesting is the way the brain functions and the major areas that are affected by trauma. By the end of the speech, I believe that my audience, you guys, will be able to understand the causes and find something interesting about mental health and traumatic experiences. Having studied and known with the anatomy of the brain and the human body, and knowing the psychological explanation of why the brain responds the way it does, I've been able to dig deeper into the human brain and learn more of its functions and the unanswered questions to the very own brain, which is our brain. I plan to offer you guys as much information as possible of how trauma affects you physically and emotionally. I will cover three main topics in this speech: what trauma is and where does it start, how can you treat trauma, and what it does to you physically and mentally. As I mentioned before, trauma falls into a psychological matter that occurs to the mind and occurs in a result of a distressing event happening from a childhood or to an adulthood in current life. A psychological trauma, the definition on trauma, is a distressing event happening in any type of way that made you fear something, mainly as a phobia, but it differentiates into something more deeper, that's when it goes into a psychological matter. A psychological trauma to the mind, it occurs to an event, basically. How trauma occurs or starts, according to the article of siteguides.com, the cause of trauma occurs in a very distressful event that can occur to anyone. The common sources are domestic violence, natural disasters, severe injury, death of a loved one, or witnessing an act of violence. They also state that it is also possible to sustain trauma after witnessing something very traumatic. Finally, children appear to be more vulnerable to trauma more than common adults. This happening being saying if you're abused by anyone in a childhood when you're a child, it affects you mentally during that stage, and it carries on all your life until you get it treated. It's more severe with children that are less than the age of 15 due to the matter that their minds are not mentally stable and not mentally grown yet, and they're still going through the process of the brain through growing, and the brain stops growing in the age of around 25 to 28 years old. Having known the main causes of trauma are, what is more compelling and interesting is how to treat trauma and get a proper level and training and learning basically to control over that trauma and handle that trauma efficiently to reassure yourself that you don't have that trauma anymore. So my other point is how to treat trauma. There's many ways to treat trauma. For example, according to the MAYO clinic, in 2018, there are many treatments of psychotherapy, which is talk therapy, such as a cognitive therapy or exposure therapy. Cognitive therapy allows you to recognize a way of thinking that are pulling you down from moving on from that trauma. Exposure therapy is a behavioral therapy that helps you face a traumatic state and the memories of that trauma and that situation. There are many medications also that people get prescribed so they can be able to get their mind a little bit more stable and healthy and help reduce memories of that traumatic event. There are antidepressants, anti-anxiety medications, and prazosin, which reduces the negative thoughts. Basically, if you have a person that takes that medicine, which is prazosin, it reduces any types of negative thoughts, suicide thoughts, any sort of that stuff. It reduces that level. Okay? So mostly the treatments are very simple. It takes a lot of dedication if you want to do any type of psychotherapy, a lot of years to process that and get your brain back to a healthy state. As it seems, treatments are very complex and helpful to those that suffer any type of traumatic experience, and trauma does affect you physically and mentally, and this is how it does. Trauma can be diversified into post-traumatic stress disorders and childhood traumas, which I mentioned earlier, that traumas from childhood are way different from post-traumatic stress. But according to Dr. Jennifer Sweden, there are three main areas of the brain where trauma is more provocative. The prefrontal cortex, which is the PFC, which is also known as the thinking center. The anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, which is also called as an emotion regulation center. And the amygdala, also known as the fear center. This is an image describing the main thoughts of where the areas are affected by the brain during the traumatic period. What else? So only three main areas of the brain are affected by this, if it goes to that very high stage. The thinking center and the emotion regulation center of the brain is underactivated, and the fear center of the brain is overactivated. So two parts of the brain are overly activated, while one part of the brain is underactivated, making it a distressful event to the brain, making it swell up in emotions and drag down the person's fear, basically putting down the person into a very low level of feeling depressed or exhausted or confused by the situation of the trauma, having nightmares and all that stuff too. It is very clear what trauma does to you and affect the human brain in an emotional sense, and physical trauma causes and includes exhaustion, confusion, sadness, anxiety, and many sorts of other confusion too, which goes under more conspirative information. So today I discussed the main ideas of trauma, how it works, where does it come from, and how to treat it. If you know someone that is suffering from any traumatic state from childhood to post-traumatic, be sure to help them out and help them get out of that stress disorder, I guess, from that. And trauma is a very serious condition and can be lethal to some people, deadly, in other words. Having any type of trauma can affect your life significantly negatively. That's it.